I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
It is perhaps fitting that one of the most perplexing mysteries of my long association with Hercule Poirot should have begun on Christmas Eve, when the world wraps itself in innocent finery and mischief peers out from behind the holly. I had been invited to Greystone Hall by my old friend Colonel Redmayne, a bluff, cheerful fellow from my regiment days, who insisted that a proper country Christmas would restore my spirits after a rather trying autumn in London. My wife was visiting her aunt in Sussex, and though I made some protest about leaving town during the season, the Colonel's promise of excellent shooting, a roaring fire, and Lady Carrington's legendary Christmas pudding overcame my reluctance. Greystone Hall lay some 20 miles from Oxford, perched upon a gentle rise with its Tudor facade gazing serenely over snow-laden lawns and precisely clipped yew hedges. The snow had been falling steadily since afternoon, transforming the landscape into something from a Christmas card, with that peculiar hush that seems to muffle not just sound, but time itself. Lanterns glowed warmly along the curved drive, and as our motor crunched through the pristine drifts, I confess I felt that particular lift of spirits that the season invariably brings. Our hostess was Lady Euphemia Carrington, Effie to her intimates, though I should clarify that I was not among that privileged circle. Picture a woman of perhaps 55 years, handsome in that commanding way that speaks of generations of authority, with silver-touched auburn hair and eyes that could be remarkably warm when she chose. Widowed 5 years prior by Sir Lionel Carrington's sudden passing, she had continued to manage Greystone with an iron hand wrapped in velvet, making it a coveted destination during the Christmas season. At her side hovered Miss Ivy Winterbourne, her companion and distant cousin, a thin, nervous creature of perhaps 30 years, who possessed the unfortunate habit of starting at unexpected sounds and worrying her handkerchief into tatters. Despite her timid nature, I observed that her pale blue eyes missed very little of what transpired around her. The Carrington offspring were both present. Mr. Peter Carrington, a handsome young man of 28 with his father's laugh and an alarming tendency toward practical jokes, his evening dress adorned with a waistcoat of particularly vivid peacock blue, and Miss Diana Carrington, who had inherited her mother's striking looks, softened by youth, though when she thought herself unobserved, her expression betrayed a restlessness that suggested the quiet country life might not entirely suit her temperament. Diana was engaged to Mr. Adrian Lacey, the rising Member of Parliament for West Tolland, a dark, smoothly polished gentleman whose every sentence seemed carefully crafted to reveal nothing while implying everything. I found myself rather put off by his manner, though I could not precisely articulate why. The remaining guests formed an intriguing collection. Reverend Gideon Vale, the local vicar, whose imposing physical presence — he stood well over 6 feet with shoulders like a rugby forward — was tempered by surprisingly gentle brown eyes. Dr. Noel Pritchard, the village physician, a precise, observant man whose attention to detail suggested a mind more suited to detection than medicine. Mr. Edward Swain, the family solicitor, whose correctness in dress and speech bordered on the theatrical. Mademoiselle Irina Volney, a singer with the most extraordinary emerald eyes, and an accent that made even mundane observations sound like intimate confidences. And finally, Mr. Roland Stanhope. It was Mr. Stanhope who commanded the most attention that evening, though he seemed to accomplish this through some indefinable magnetism rather than any obvious effort. The newspapers had dubbed him the Christmas millionaire, following his substantial donation to St. Bede's Hospital earlier that year. His fortune, rumored to have been made in South American ventures, coffee, minerals, perhaps other things, had provided him with an ease of manner that suggested he found life thoroughly amusing. He possessed that rare quality of making each person he addressed feel as though they were the only individual in the room worthy of his attention. After an excellent dinner featuring Lady Carrington's justly famous roast beef and a particularly fine claret, We gathered in the great hall where an enormous Christmas tree nearly brushed the carved gallery above. The ancient beams were festooned with holly and ivy, and a massive Yule log sent cheerful sparks dancing up the chimney. The atmosphere was precisely what one hopes for at Christmas. Warm, convivial, and touched with that gentle conspiracy that develops among a well-matched house party. "Now then," announced Peter with evident excitement, "we shall revive the old family tradition tonight. Mother has finally agreed to the midnight guest ceremony." "Peter," Lady Carrington's voice carried both affection and warning. "Do not make it sound theatrical. It is simply a pleasant custom, nothing more." "What manner of custom?" I inquired, my curiosity piqued. Diana smiled, her eyes dancing with mischief. "We call it the midnight guest. After the wassailing, each person visits the oak room alone, carrying a single candle. There's an ancient book on the escritoire where you write a wish for the coming year, and you leave some small token in the silver bowl, whatever happens to be in your pocket. When finished, you ring the handbell and depart. One at a time, mind you, and no conversation permitted during the ceremony." "How delightfully atmospheric," murmured Mademoiselle Volney. "And what if one's wish is rather wicked?" "Then you simply lie," replied Adrian Lacey with that smooth smile of his. "Parliament has taught me that truth is largely a matter of presentation." The household was duly organized by Forbes. The butler, a man whose 30 years of service had refined him into the very essence of discretion and efficiency. He led us toward the long gallery, that impressive corridor with its black and gold paneling and stern portraits of long-dead Carringtons glowering down from their frames. The gallery faced east toward formal gardens now buried beneath pristine snow, and at its far end stood the carved double doors leading to the oak room itself. The oak room derived its name from the age and richness of its paneling and the massive fireplace that dominated one wall. Mullioned windows looked out upon the winter night, their latches firmly secured against the cold. The escritoire stood beneath a portrait of some particularly grim-faced Carrington ancestor, and upon it lay the Christmas book, a volume bound in red leather that had clearly seen many years of service. Beside it waited a small silver bell and an ornate bowl polished to mirror brightness. "The ceremony must be conducted properly," Lady Carrington instructed with the authority of long practice. "Forbes, you and Evans will station yourselves at either end of the gallery. No one passes except the person whose turn it is, and you must wait for the bell before admitting the next participant. The door must be closed after each visitor." "Very good, my lady," Forbes replied with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. Reverend Vale volunteered to begin, perhaps hoping to lend respectability to what some might consider a pagan ritual. He accepted the candle with his surprisingly delicate hands and proceeded down the gallery alone, the ancient floorboards creaking softly under his considerable weight. The oak room door closed behind him with a solid thud that seemed to emphasize the solemnity of the moment. We waited in the peculiar silence that such ceremonies create, a house that normally rustles with life, holding its breath in anticipation. The faint sound of the bell reached us, and Forbes admitted Dr. Pritchard for his turn. And so it continued, each participant disappearing behind those carved doors for their private moment with tradition, and returning with the satisfied air of duty accomplished. I recall that Mr. Stanhope, who was to follow Mademoiselle Volney, made a curious remark as he awaited his turn. "There is a particular art," he said quietly, "to leaving a room without being observed." "Indeed," I replied, somewhat puzzled by the observation. His dark eyes held mine for a moment. "Sometimes absences speak more eloquently than presences, don't you think?" He glanced meaningfully toward Lady Carrington, then straightened his shoulders and entered the oak room as the bell announced Mademoiselle Volney's completion of the ritual. I confess I felt a flicker of irritation at his enigmatic manner. Clever young men who cannot resist being mysterious are well enough on the stage, but rather tiresome in drawing rooms. Mademoiselle Volney emerged with an amused smile playing about, her lips murmuring something about having wished perhaps too much as she set her gloves upon a side table and began humming Il est né softly to herself. We waited. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Lady Carrington's expression sharpened with concern. The bell remained silent. Forbes looked to his mistress for guidance, received a curt nod, and approached the oak room door. He knocked politely. No response. He turned the handle and pushed the door wide. The oak room was empty. The impossibility of the situation struck us not as shock, but as a profound dislocation, as though the very foundations of reality had shifted beneath our feet. We crowded into the doorway, and then, abandoning all pretense of ceremony, filed into the room in a confused cluster. The air hung still and undisturbed. The single candle flickered in some imperceptible draught, casting dancing shadows across the ancient paneling. The red leather book sat open upon the escritoire, the pen laid neatly across its pages. Every window remained firmly latched, their leaded glass reflecting our bewildered faces. The heavy curtains hung motionless. There was simply nowhere a man could conceal himself. The paneling was unbroken, the corners square and empty. "Perhaps behind the screen," suggested Peter, but the decorative screen had been removed for the season. Forbes methodically tested each window latch. They were stiff with disuse and clearly had not been disturbed for weeks. The door through which we had entered led only to the long gallery, where Evans stood at his post, as honest and reliable as only a young man fearful of losing his position could be. "This is absurd," declared Mr. Swain with professional irritation. "The gentleman must be somewhere in the room." "He is demonstrably not in the room," Dr. Pritchard replied crisply, "unless he has achieved invisibility." Lady Carrington had gone quite pale. "Mr. Stanhope," she called, and then again with that carrying quality that could rouse an entire household. "Mr. Stanhope." "Perhaps he slipped out behind Mademoiselle Volney as some sort of jest," Adrian Lacey suggested, though his tone suggested he found the possibility unlikely. "No one passed me, sir," Evans declared from the gallery. "I'm certain of that." Reverend Vale approached the escritoire with the careful reverence of a man accustomed to handling precious manuscripts. "Let us examine whether he recorded his wish," he suggested with admirable practicality. The book revealed several entries in various hands, some flourishing, others cramped, the usual mixture of piety and veiled humor that such occasions inspire. Below Mademoiselle Volney's bold, slanting script was another line, written with considerable pressure that had bitten into the paper. I leaned forward to read it, but Lady Carrington reached across and closed the book with sharp finality. "This is ridiculous," she declared, though her voice carried an odd tremor. "It is a childish game that has gotten entirely out of hand. Mr. Swain, please ensure that all doors and windows are secured. No one is to leave the house." We conducted as thorough a search as a group of worried amateurs could manage. We examined every conceivable hiding place, beneath tables, behind curtains, even the great settle by the fireplace where a child might play hide-and-seek but a grown man could never fit. We tested the paneling with the reverent care due such ancient craftsmanship, finding no hidden springs or secret passages. Peter, with youthful enthusiasm, even thrust his hand up the chimney, withdrawing it with a cry of pain and a flake of glowing ash clinging to his skin. "Careful," Dr. Pritchard snapped, examining the burn with professional efficiency. It was Diana who made the first significant discovery. "Look here," she said quietly, pointing to the arm of the chair beside the escritoire. There, placed with almost deliberate precision, lay a single glove. Fine kid leather of the sort purchased in Bond Street, with the initials ARS stamped in tiny gold letters upon the back. "I observed Mr. Stanhope place those gloves in his pocket after dinner," Dr. Pritchard said thoughtfully. "I remember it distinctly because he dropped one, and Miss Winterbourne retrieved it for him." Miss Winterbourne started at the mention of her name. colouring painfully. Yes, she stammered. He thanked me most politely. The search continued with increasing desperation. More than once I found myself staring up at the stern portrait above the escritoire, half expecting that grim-faced ancestor to have transformed into a doorway. The windows remained fast, the carpet showed no marks save those made by our own feet, and if Mr. Stanhope had departed that room by walking, crawling, or sliding, he had accomplished it by passing through solid matter. As we concluded our fruitless efforts, I noticed Lady Carrington standing by the mantelpiece, something concealed in her hand. Making a pretense of warming myself at the fire, I glimpsed the charred corner of a sheet of paper bearing the faint letters, Rington. She saw that I had observed her discovery and calmly placed the fragment in a small enamelled box on the mantel. "Please," she whispered so quietly that only I could hear. "There are things." She did not complete the thought, but her eyes conveyed both an appeal and a command. The village church bell began to chime the 11:45 as the snow resumed its gentle fall outside our windows. Lady Carrington drew herself to her full height with the resolution of a woman accustomed to command. "Mr. Swain," she directed, "please have the servants assemble in the hall. Reverend Vale, would you be so kind as to escort the ladies to the morning room? Dr. Pritchard, remain with Miss Winterbourne. She appears overwrought. Colonel Redmayne, you and Mr. Lacey and Peter will search the ground floor systematically." She paused, her gaze finding mine. "Captain Hastings, I believe you maintain a correspondence with Monsieur Hercule Poirot?" "Indeed I do, Lady Carrington." "Then I think," she said, her voice steady despite the strain evident in her features, "that you should send him an urgent wire. If this is merely some elaborate foolishness, he will expose it quickly. If it is something more serious—" She left the darker possibility unspoken. I retired to the library where the telephone stood, but the line proved unreliable in the storm, voices fading in and out like spirits in a séance. Instead, I composed a telegram with fingers made clumsy by cold and urgency. "Come at once if possible. Extraordinary disappearance at Greystone Hall, near Marston. Christmas Eve. Man vanished from locked room between two witnesses. Lady Carrington requests your immediate presence. Hastings." As I sealed the envelope, I experienced an almost childish sense of relief, as though the mere act of summoning him would conjure Poirot from the storm with his immaculate appearance untouched and that faint scent of hair tonic that somehow always preceded the restoration of order to chaos. The hall had filled with confused voices and anxious faces. The house that had been so merry an hour before had become a stage where uneasiness rehearsed its lines. Near the library door, Miss Winterbourne sat rigidly upright, her hands clenched in her lap. "It was only a game," she murmured, to no one in particular as I passed. "It was meant to be only a game." As we finally closed the door upon the empty oak room, the candle guttered and died, whether from natural draught or something more theatrical I could not say. But as I stood in that corridor lined with the portraits of dead Carringtons, I could not shake the feeling that we had witnessed something that defied not merely explanation, but the very laws that govern our ordered world. Our midnight guest, so carefully prepared for and confidently expected, had indeed arrived, but in a manner none of us could have anticipated. He had come by vanishing entirely, leaving behind only questions that would require the particular genius of Belgium's greatest detective to answer. The telegram dispatched, I returned to find the household settled into that peculiar vigil that follows an inexplicable crisis. Lady Carrington had organized systematic searches of every room, cupboard, and corridor, while Forbes stationed footmen at strategic points throughout the house. The servants, initially bewildered by the midnight commotion, now moved with the hushed efficiency of those who understand that their very positions might depend upon discretion and cooperation. Sergeant Miller arrived from the village constabulary within the hour, a solid, practical man whose initial skepticism gave way to genuine bewilderment as he examined the oak room. His methodical search yielded nothing our amateur efforts had not already discovered, and I could see his confidence in the rational world beginning to fray at the edges. The snow continued its relentless fall, effectively sealing us within Greystone Hall and adding an element of isolation that seemed to press upon everyone's nerves. The night stretched endlessly. Sleep proved impossible for most of us. I spent the dark hours in the library, attempting to reach Poirot by telephone, but the storm had rendered communication sporadic at best. Miss Winterbourne huddled in the morning room, refusing Dr. Pritchard's offer of a sedative, while Mademoiselle Volney paced the corridors, humming fragments of opera in a manner that struck me as either theatrical or genuinely nervous. Peter made several attempts at levity that fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere, and even Reverend Vale's customary serenity appeared strained. It was shortly after 8 o'clock on Christmas morning when the sound of a motor struggling through the snow announced salvation. From the drawing-room window, I watched a modest hired car navigate the treacherous drive, and my heart lifted as a familiar figure emerged, immaculate despite the journey. Hercule Poirot stepped from the vehicle as though he had traveled from Mayfair rather than through a blizzard, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his mustaches perfectly waxed, his small person radiating that indefinable air of competence that had never failed to restore my confidence in the ultimate triumph of reason. "Mon ami Hastings," he greeted me with a slight shake of his head at my disheveled appearance. "You summon me to witness a Christmas miracle, n'est-ce pas? A gentleman who achieves the impossible feat of departing without leaving." Lady Carrington received him with the gracious relief of one accustomed to command, but grateful to relinquish it to superior authority. Within minutes, he had assembled the household in the great hall and listened to our collective account with that absolute attention that made each speaker feel their words were being weighed with scientific precision. "So," he murmured when the tale was complete, his green eyes cataloguing every face before him, "we have a locked room, 2 sentries, and a vanished guest. But Poirot, he does not concern himself with impossibilities. Instead, he asks, why must this gentleman appear to vanish? What purpose does this seeming miracle serve?" He moved toward the oak room with his characteristic gliding walk, pausing to examine Forbes and Evans with the same methodical attention he might give to evidence. "You are certain of your positions? No one passed between the time Mademoiselle Volney departed and you discovered the room empty?" Both men affirmed their certainty with the emphasis of those whose livelihoods depended upon their reliability. In the oak room itself, Poirot stood motionless for a full minute, breathing deeply. Wax from the candle, polish from the wood, and something else, a scent that does not belong to this ancient chamber. He approached the escritoire with delicate steps, examining the red leather book, then the glove upon the chair arm. "This glove," he announced, "it is placed with intention, not dropped in haste. See how it lies. Precisely positioned where it cannot be missed, the initials displayed just so." His fingertips hovered over the kid leather without quite touching it. "And the book? Mon Dieu, what pressure was used to write this final entry? The hand that compels itself to write what it does not wish to record." He turned to face us, his expression grave yet somehow satisfied. "Lady Carrington, you will permit that I interview each person separately. Beginning, I think, with Mademoiselle Volney, who was the last to see Monsieur Stanhope before his remarkable departure." The investigation had begun in earnest, and despite the impossible circumstances, I felt that familiar stirring of confidence that accompanied Poirot's methodical assault upon mystery. Poirot established himself in the morning room with Mademoiselle Volney, positioning his chair with that precise attention to angle and distance that characterized his every movement. The singer arranged herself with practiced grace, though I detected a tension beneath her polished exterior that suggested she was not entirely at ease with his scrutiny. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, his tone conversational, yet carrying that peculiar authority that made evasion seem futile. "You were the final person to complete the ceremony before Monsieur Stanhope's turn. Tell me, if you please, of your observations of this gentleman's demeanor." Her emerald eyes met his directly, though her fingers betrayed her nervousness by their slight movement against her burgundy morning dress. "He seemed preoccupied, Monsieur Poirot. Not with our silly ceremony, but with something that weighed heavily upon his mind. When I emerged from the oak room, he made some pleasantry about the cold, but his attention was elsewhere entirely." "Elsewhere? You mean his thoughts, or perhaps his gaze?" "Both, I think. He kept glancing toward Lady Carrington, though he attempted to disguise his interest. There was something between them, some understanding that excluded the rest of us." She hesitated, then continued with apparent reluctance. "I have performed in many drawing-rooms, Monsieur Poirot. One learns to read the undercurrents that polite society prefers to conceal. They knew each other far better than they wished us to believe." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally, and his remark about departing unobserved. "You mentioned this to mon ami Hastings." "Ah, yes. He said something about it being easier to arrive unnoticed than to depart unseen. At the time, I thought it merely clever conversation, but now—" She shivered delicately. "Perhaps it was more prophetic than witty." When Mademoiselle Volney departed, Poirot requested Miss Winterbourne, who entered with visible reluctance, her pale hands trembling as she took the chair. Her nervousness was so pronounced that Poirot gentled his manner considerably. "Mademoiselle Winterbourne, you have been most observant during your time in this household. Last evening, when Monsieur Stanhope dropped his glove and you retrieved it for him, what did you notice of his behavior throughout the evening?" Her color deepened painfully. "He was most courteous, sir, but earlier, during dinner, I observed him studying the family portraits with unusual intensity, particularly the one of Sir Lionel in the great hall." This detail arrested Poirot's complete attention. "The portrait of the late Sir Lionel. You are certain of this observation?" "Quite certain, sir. He stood before it for several minutes while the others were at table. I happened to pass through the hall and saw him there. He seemed troubled, perhaps, as though the portrait reminded him of something unpleasant." "And did you mention this to anyone?" Miss Winterbourne's agitation increased markedly. "I spoke of it to Lady Carrington when she noticed my attention and inquired what had caught my interest. When I told her, she became quite pale and excused herself from the drawing-room for several minutes." After Miss Winterbourne's departure, Poirot turned to examine the Christmas book, which Lady Carrington had reluctantly provided. He studied it with that methodical attention he brought to all evidence, examining the pressure of the pen strokes, the quality of the ink, the indentations beneath each entry. When he reached the final line, written in Stanhope's hand with such force that the nib had nearly torn the paper, he read aloud, "Forgive me. This is not a wish for the coming year," he murmured thoughtfully. "This is a statement of confession or regret. But for what does Monsieur Stanhope seek forgiveness?" Lady Carrington entered at his request, maintaining her composure, though I detected a new wariness in her manner. Poirot regarded her with that deceptively mild expression that had unraveled so many carefully constructed deceptions. "Madame, you will permit that I examine the fragment of paper you discovered in the oak-room fireplace, the one you preserved in the enameled box." Her hesitation lasted only a moment before she retrieved the box from the mantelpiece. The charred corner bore the faint letters "Rington" in what appeared to be the same forceful handwriting we had observed in the Christmas book. "You recognize the significance of this fragment immediately," Poirot observed. "That is why you preserved it so carefully." "I thought it might be important," she replied, though her voice carried a tremor that suggested she knew far more than she was willing to reveal. "And your acquaintance with Monsieur Stanhope? Mademoiselle Volney observed that you knew each other better than you wished the household to believe." Lady Carrington's composure wavered visibly. "Mr. Stanhope was a friend of my late husband's. They had business dealings some years ago. I had not seen him since Lionel's death until he appeared at my door yesterday, requesting an invitation for Christmas Eve. Requesting or demanding? The silence that followed was answer enough. Poirot nodded with satisfaction, as though a crucial piece of his mental puzzle had fallen into place. "Mon ami Hastings," he said, turning to me. "You observed Monsieur Stanhope's behavior throughout the evening. What struck you most particularly about his manner?" I recounted my impressions, emphasizing Stanhope's enigmatic remarks and his apparent familiarity with the household, despite Lady Carrington's claims of distant acquaintance. Poirot listened with that absolute attention that made every detail seem significant. "Excellent. Now, I think we must examine the oak room once more, but this time with the knowledge we have gained." He rose with sudden energy. "For I begin to suspect that Monsieur Stanhope's disappearance was not the impossible feat it appears, but rather a carefully orchestrated deception designed to accomplish something that required absolute privacy and the certainty that he would not be disturbed." As we prepared to return to the scene of the mystery, I noticed that Poirot's expression had taken on that particular satisfaction that indicated he was beginning to perceive the true shape of the puzzle, even if all the pieces had not yet revealed themselves. In the oak room, Poirot moved with renewed purpose, his previous interviews having sharpened his focus considerably. He approached the escritoire and knelt beside it, examining the carpet with his magnifying glass. The winter light streaming through the mullioned windows illuminated faint impressions in the thick pile that our earlier trampling had not entirely obscured. "Regardez, Hastings," he murmured, indicating a slight discoloration near the fireplace hearth. "Someone knelt here recently and for some time. The carpet shows the impression of knees, but also of hands pressed flat against the floor. This suggests not prayer, but the careful examination of something concealed beneath." He moved to the fireplace itself, studying the cold ashes with scientific precision. Using a small implement from his waistcoat pocket, he stirred the grey remnants delicately. "Paper has been burned here, and recently. Not merely the Christmas wrappings one might expect, but documents of quality stationery. The ash is too fine for ordinary correspondence, too uniform for household papers." Lady Carrington, who had remained silent during this examination, grew visibly pale as Poirot continued his methodical investigation. He straightened and regarded her with that penetrating stare that seemed to see through carefully constructed facades. "Madame, I begin to perceive that Monsieur Stanhope's disappearance was not the supernatural feat it appears, but rather a carefully orchestrated performance. The glove placed with theatrical precision, the dramatic message in the Christmas book, the very impossibility of the vanishing itself, all suggest a man who wished us to believe he had achieved the impossible, when in truth he had accomplished something far more mundane but infinitely more significant." The silence that followed was broken by Peter Carrington's arrival, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. At Poirot's gentle encouragement, he revealed information that cast the entire evening in a new and sinister light. "Monsieur Poirot," Peter said quietly, glancing toward his mother with obvious reluctance, "there are things about Mr. Stanhope that haven't been mentioned. He wasn't merely a business associate of my father's. He was present when Father died 5 years ago. They were alone together in Father's study when Father collapsed from what Dr. Pritchard called a heart attack." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Indeed?" And this circumstance occasioned no particular comment. There were whispers. Peter continued, his voice dropping further. Questions about certain financial irregularities that came to light after Father's death. Stanhope left for South America immediately afterward, and we heard nothing from him until yesterday. When he appeared at our door, Mother was terrified, though she tried to hide it. Lady Carrington's composure cracked visibly at this revelation. "Peter, you don't understand the complexities." "I understand enough," Peter interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness. "Last night, before dinner, I overheard Stanhope speaking to you in the conservatory. He mentioned settling old accounts and justice delayed but not forgotten. You were pleading with him, Mother. This revelation transformed Poirot's understanding entirely. He turned to Lady Carrington with renewed intensity. So, Madame, Monsieur Stanhope came here not as a guest seeking Christmas hospitality, but as a man with demands to make. The fragment of paper bearing your family name was not accidentally dropped into the fire. It was deliberately burned by someone who wished to destroy evidence of some communication or agreement. At this moment, Adrian Lacey appeared in the doorway, his political composure intact, but his eyes watchful. Poirot regarded him with interest as he entered. Mr. Lacey, you are engaged to Miss Carrington. I understand Monsieur Stanhope made inquiries regarding her happiness yesterday evening. Adrian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. A rather forward question, I thought. But I assured him Diana is perfectly content. Our engagement represents considerable planning and mutual affection. And your own acquaintance with Monsieur Stanhope. None whatsoever, Monsieur Poirot. His reputation, while public, is rather vague. South American ventures, I understand, not the sort one typically encounters in our circles. The subtle dismissiveness in his tone did not escape Poirot's notice. As Adrian departed, Poirot turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. Mon ami, we are not dealing with supernatural mysteries, but with very human motives of fear, guilt, and the desperate desire to conceal old crimes. Monsieur Stanhope's disappearance was indeed a performance, but one designed to accomplish something that required absolute privacy and the certainty that he would not be interrupted. The investigation had taken a decidedly darker turn, and I found myself wondering whether our Christmas mystery would prove to involve not merely vanishing, but something far more sinister. Poirot returned to the oak room with renewed purpose, his interviews having provided crucial context for understanding the evening's events. He knelt beside the fireplace, stirring the cold ashes with a delicate implement from his waistcoat pocket. The grey remnants yielded their secrets reluctantly, but his persistence was rewarded when he extracted a tiny, glossy bead the size of a pea, glinting red as a holly berry. Sealing wax, he announced, holding it to the light, not the cheap sort used for household correspondence. This is a strong composition with resin, the type employed for important documents. Someone sealed a packet here last night, and someone burned its wrapper. His penetrating gaze found Lady Carrington. The fragment you preserved was not the only paper consumed by these flames. Before anyone could respond, Sergeant Miller's voice called urgently from the grounds outside. We hurried to the windows to see him standing near the yew hedges, gesturing excitedly towards something in the snow. Within minutes, we had assembled outside where the sergeant displayed his discovery with evident satisfaction. A clear boot print leading away from the house toward the lane, and beside it, a silver hip flask bearing the initials R.S. "There's your answer, Monsieur Poirot," Miller declared triumphantly. "The gentleman never vanished at all. He slipped out somehow and made his escape through the grounds. Probably had a motor waiting in the lane." The relief among the household was palpable. Peter Carrington's face brightened considerably. So it was merely an elaborate jest after all, rather typical of someone who enjoys theatrical gestures. Adrian Lacey nodded approvingly, while Dr. Pritchard observed with professional satisfaction, "A man of means could easily arrange such transportation. The mystery resolves itself quite logically." Even Lady Carrington seemed to draw breath more easily, though I noticed her fingers still clutched the enameled box containing the burned paper fragment. The general consensus was that Stanhope had played an elaborate, if poorly timed, practical joke and departed under cover of the storm. But Poirot stood apart from the relieved murmurs, his expression thoughtful rather than satisfied. He walked slowly around the boot print, examining it from multiple angles, then cast a discerning eye toward the oak room windows, which remained securely latched. "Mon ami Hastings," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind, "do you not find this evidence remarkably convenient? A man of Monsieur Stanhope's intelligence who wished to depart unseen would hardly leave such an obvious trail. And this hip flask, so perfectly positioned for discovery, bearing his initials like a calling card, it is almost as though it was intended to be found. His observation cast a shadow over the prevailing optimism. Miss Winterbourne's relief faded, replaced by renewed anxiety, while I noticed Adrian Lacey's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Lady Carrington's momentary ease vanished entirely. Returning to the oak room, Poirot began a more systematic examination of the ancient paneling, his fingertips tracing the carved moldings with scientific precision. What had seemed impossible now appeared to him merely improbable, and improbability was territory where his methods thrived. The builders of this house understood that privacy sometimes required more than locked doors, he murmured, pressing his ear against a section near the fireplace. The difference in resonance was subtle but unmistakable. One section produced a hollow sound suggesting space beyond. His exploration revealed a nearly invisible catch concealed within the carved acanthus leaves. With a soft click, a narrow panel swung inward, exposing a passage barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The cramped space showed recent disturbance in the scuff marks on the floor and displaced cobwebs. "Voilà," Poirot said with quiet satisfaction. Monsieur Stanhope's impossible departure becomes merely theatrical, but the question remains, why did he require such elaborate privacy? What lay beyond this passage that justified such deception? As we prepared to explore the hidden corridor, Forbes appeared with obvious distress. "Begging your pardon, Monsieur Poirot, but there's been another discovery. In the conservatory, sir, there's broken glass and what appears to be blood on the flagstones." The implication struck us immediately. If Stanhope had used the secret passage for his theatrical disappearance, why had violence apparently occurred elsewhere in the house? Our Christmas mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and the convenient evidence in the snow now seemed less like solution than misdirection. The investigation had taken a decidedly darker turn, and I realized that what had begun as an impossible vanishing was transforming into something far more sinister. We followed Forbes through the corridors with mounting apprehension, the household's earlier relief now completely evaporated. The conservatory lay at the eastern end of Greystone Hall, its glass walls normally offering a cheerful refuge during winter months. Now, however, the morning light revealed a scene that transformed our Christmas mystery into something far more sinister. Several panes of glass lay shattered near the ornamental fountain, their fragments scattered across the flagstone floor in a pattern that immediately caught Poirot's attention. Dark stains marked the pale stones, and the deep crimson color left little doubt about their nature. Most significantly, a gentleman's evening shoe lay on its side near the broken glass, its patent leather surface marred by what appeared to be the same dark substance. Poirot approached with his characteristic methodical precision, his small frame moving with surgical care. He knelt beside the bloodstain, examining its edges and the direction of the scattered droplets through his magnifying glass. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he studied the scene. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind rattling the remaining glass panels. "The greater part of the glass lies within the conservatory, suggesting a blow from without. And yet, where are the footprints outside that would proclaim this nocturnal intruder?" He moved to examine the exterior, where pristine snow showed no disturbance whatsoever. The storm ceased at 6 this morning, according to Sergeant Miller. But these glass fragments nearest the threshold bear no snow at all. They fell after the storm ended. The implication was clear. Someone had broken the glass deliberately to create the appearance of an escape route, but had done so hours after Stanhope's disappearance from the oak room. Dr. Pritchard knelt beside the stains with professional interest. The quantity suggests a significant injury, though the pattern indicates the person remained conscious and mobile. Head wounds bleed profusely, as do cuts to the hands or forearms. "Precisely," Poirot agreed. But notice how the drops lead toward the door, then stop abruptly. No corresponding trail marks the corridor beyond. He straightened and began examining the overturned plants and disturbed soil with scientific precision. Among the scattered earth, his keen eyes detected a charred cylinder scarcely half an inch long. "A cigarillo end," he announced, holding it delicately. "South American tobacco. Very distinctive. Monsieur Stanhope smoked such after dinner, did he not, Dr. Pritchard?" "Indeed." I remarked upon the unusual aroma. Poirot's exploration continued methodically. Beneath a large jardiniere, he discovered a torn fragment of fine kid leather, stained faintly with blood. The material matched perfectly the glove we had found in the oak room. At this moment, Adrian Lacey appeared in the doorway, and Poirot's attention focused on him with renewed interest. "Mr. Lacey, Dr. Pritchard mentioned you required medical attention this morning." Adrian's political composure remained intact, though I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. A minor cut across the palm. I broke a glass washing my toothbrush tumbler, rather clumsy of me. "Indeed," Poirot replied with that deceptively mild tone that had unraveled so many carefully constructed alibis. Reverend Vale, who had been observing in troubled silence, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Monsieur Poirot, I feel compelled to mention something. During my midnight walk to settle my nerves after the evening's excitement, I observed a light in the conservatory. This would have been perhaps an hour after we discovered the empty oak room. This revelation electrified our group. Lady Carrington grew visibly pale, while Miss Winterbourne's nervous agitation increased markedly. "You observed this light, but did not investigate?" Poirot inquired. "I assumed it was one of the servants attending to some duty," Reverend Vale replied with evident discomfort. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then began tracing the secret passage we had discovered. The narrow corridor proved to extend further than initially realized, with one branch leading directly toward the conservatory, emerging behind ornamental screening that would have provided perfect concealment. "So," Poirot said with grim satisfaction, "Monsieur Stanhope could indeed have departed the oak room unseen, traveled through these passages, and arrived here without encountering anyone. But the evidence suggests something far more complex than a simple escape." He surveyed the scene once more, his green eyes cataloguing every detail. "We have here a carefully orchestrated performance, mes amis. The boot print in the snow, the broken glass with its convenient timing, the blood and torn glove, all designed to convince us that Monsieur Stanhope departed into the night. But there is always the little thing that does not persuade." His gaze swept across the assembled faces, and I realized that Poirot was beginning to perceive the true shape of our Christmas mystery, one that involved not supernatural vanishing, but very human motives of deception, fear, and perhaps something far more deadly than any of us had yet imagined. Poirot's examination of the conservatory evidence had revealed its staged nature, but his methodical mind was not yet satisfied. He returned to the oak room with renewed purpose, his attention drawn to the small silver bell that had failed to announce Stanhope's completion of the ceremony. "Hastings," he murmured, lifting the bell with delicate fingers. "Observe how this clapper moves with such silence." He touched the metal tongue with the tip of his nail, revealing a faint, greasy film. "Someone has applied a substance here, petroleum jelly perhaps, to muffle the sound completely. Our sentries relied upon this bell to time the entries, but if Monsieur Stanhope ensured it would not ring, he purchased precious minutes of absolute solitude." The implications struck me immediately. Without the bell's signal, no one would have known when Stanhope had supposedly completed his turn, allowing him unlimited time for whatever private business had brought him to Greystone Hall. At this moment, Miss Winterbourne appeared in the doorway, her pale face streaked with tears and her nervous agitation having reached a breaking point. She moved toward us with the desperate resolve of someone who could no longer bear the weight of concealed knowledge. "He threatened her," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush of loyalty and fear. "Mr. Stanhope said terrible things about Sir Lionel. about money that had gone missing, about secrets that would destroy the family's reputation. He demanded payment for his silence, and when Lady Carrington refused, he became quite violent in his manner. Lady Carrington, who had followed Miss Winterbourne into the room, stood frozen in the doorway as her companion's confession shattered the last pretense of normalcy. "Ivy, please, you don't understand the complexities." "I understand enough." Miss Winterbourne's voice rose with uncharacteristic strength. "I saw how he looked at you, how he spoke to you in the conservatory before dinner. He was not a guest seeking Christmas hospitality. He was a blackmailer who had come to collect what he believed was owed." Poirot nodded with grim satisfaction, as though crucial pieces of his mental puzzle were finally aligning. "Précisément, Mademoiselle Winterbourne. The boot print in the snow, so perfectly formed and isolated, no man fleeing in haste would leave such a deliberate impression. The hip flask positioned where it could not be missed, the broken glass timed hours after the supposed escape, all designed to convince us that Monsieur Stanhope had departed into the night." He moved to examine the Christmas book once more, studying the violent pressure of Stanhope's final entry. But the evidence tells a different story entirely. The silenced bell allowed him unlimited time for his true purpose. The secret passage provided access to other parts of the house without detection, and the staged scene in the conservatory was meant to convince us that our vanished guest had met with some accident during his theatrical departure. At Poirot's request, Forbes produced a key to the muniment room, that repository of family documents and legal papers that lay beyond the secret passages. Our exploration revealed a chamber recently disturbed, with dust patterns showing clear movement toward the great oak chest where family papers were stored. Upon it lay the remnants of a broken seal, an empty envelope addressed in bold script to Lady Carrington, and the lingering scent of South American tobacco. "Someone came here seeking specific documents," Poirot observed, examining the torn sealing wax and scattered papers. "But whether they found what they sought, or whether they were interrupted in their search, remains to be determined." Dr. Pritchard, who had been observing with professional detachment, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Monsieur Poirot, if you are suggesting what I believe you are suggesting, then we must consider the possibility that someone in this household has committed murder." The word hung in the air with terrible finality. What had begun as an impossible disappearance had evolved into something far more sinister. The cheerful Christmas decorations surrounding us seemed to mock the gravity of our situation, and I realized that our holiday mystery had transformed into a matter of life and death. Poirot's green eyes swept across the assembled faces, cataloguing expressions of guilt, fear, and barely concealed panic. The cleverest deceptions, mes amis, are those that appear most impossible. But Monsieur Stanhope did not vanish into the winter night. He achieved a disappearance far more permanent, and someone in this room knows precisely why and where. The investigation had reached its critical juncture, and the atmosphere at Greystone Hall would never again recapture the innocent merriment of Christmas Eve. Our midnight guest had indeed arrived, but in a manner that would haunt the ancient halls long after the holiday season had passed into memory. The implications of murder had transformed our Christmas gathering into something far more sinister, and I could see Poirot's mind working with that methodical precision that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. He stood in the muniment room, surrounded by the evidence of Stanhope's nocturnal activities, his green eyes cataloguing every detail with scientific intensity. "The psychology of deception, Hastings," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind rattling the ancient windows, "reveals itself not in what is shown, but in what is carefully arranged to be discovered. Our vanished guest has left us a performance, but like all performances, it requires an audience willing to be deceived." He moved to examine the Christmas book once more, his fingertips tracing the violent indentations left by Stanhope's pen. "This message, forgive me, it is not the casual sentiment of a Christmas wish. It is written with the pressure of a man who knows he's about to inflict great pain, perhaps irreparable damage. But forgiveness from whom, and for what transgression? Lady Carrington, who had been maintaining her composure through sheer force of will, finally succumbed to the weight of concealed truth. She sank into the chair beside the escritoire, her aristocratic bearing crumbling like ancient parchment. "You cannot understand the position in which we found ourselves," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of carefully suppressed desperation. "When Lionel died so suddenly 5 years ago, certain irregularities came to light in the hospital charity accounts. Roland Stanhope was present when these discrepancies were discovered, and he disappeared to South America immediately afterward, taking with him knowledge that could destroy everything we had built." Poirot listened with that absolute attention that seemed to draw confession from the most reluctant souls. And when he returned yesterday, it was not for Christmas hospitality, but to collect payment for his continued silence. "He demanded £50,000, Lady Carrington continued, her words tumbling out with the relief of long-suppressed confession. "Money we simply do not possess. The estate barely maintains itself, and Diana's engagement represents our only hope of financial stability. If Stanhope's accusations became public, we would lose everything: our reputation, our home, our future." Peter Carrington stepped forward, his youthful face marked by a new maturity that the evening's revelations had forced upon him. "Mother, why didn't you tell us? We could have faced this together, found some other solution." "What solution could there be?" Lady Carrington's voice carried the weight of impossible choices. "Admit that your father had embezzled funds meant for charity. Watch Diana's engagement dissolve and our family name become synonymous with scandal. Some burdens cannot be shared, Peter." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the scattered papers in the muniment room. Among them he had discovered not only the torn envelope addressed to Lady Carrington, but also a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be financial documents dating from Sir Lionel's final months. "Monsieur Stanhope came here with a specific purpose," Poirot announced with growing certainty. "The silenced bell, the secret passage, the theatrical disappearance, all designed to provide him with unlimited time and absolute privacy for his true mission. He was not merely collecting blackmail, mes amis. He was retrieving evidence that he had previously concealed in this very house." At this moment, I noticed Adrian Lacey standing in the doorway, his political composure intact, but his eyes watchful in a way that suggested he was calculating the implications of every revelation. His bandaged hand, I observed, trembled almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Lacey," Poirot said with deceptive mildness, "you have been remarkably quiet during these proceedings. Perhaps you would share your observations of Monsieur Stanhope's behavior last evening?" Adrian's smile maintained its political perfection, though I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "I found him rather forward in his inquiries about Diana's happiness and our engagement plans. Not the sort of questions one expects from a casual acquaintance." "Indeed," Poirot replied, his gaze never leaving Adrian's face. "And your own movements after the household retired? Reverend Vale mentioned observing someone in the corridors during his midnight walk." The accusation hung in the air with terrible clarity. Adrian's training in parliamentary debate served him well, but I could see the calculation behind his measured response. "I was restless after the evening's excitement," he admitted carefully. "Sleep proved impossible, so I walked the corridors to settle my nerves. I encountered no one and observed nothing unusual." Poirot nodded as though accepting this explanation, but I knew him well enough to recognize the satisfaction in his expression. He had identified the psychological pressure points that would prove crucial to his final revelation. "There is something else," Miss Winterbourne said suddenly, her voice strengthened by the courage that confession had given her. "During the ceremony, when each person returned from the oak room, I noticed that someone's evening dress had been disturbed. A waistcoat button was missing, and there were faint stains on the sleeve that hadn't been there during dinner." The revelation electrified our small group, and I realized that Poirot's methodical investigation was approaching its crucial moment. The truth about Roland Stanhope's disappearance was finally beginning to emerge from the carefully constructed web of deception and misdirection that had transformed our Christmas mystery into something far more deadly than any of us had imagined. "The evidence speaks, mes amis," Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying that note of finality that indicated he had assembled the crucial pieces of his mental puzzle. "But it tells a story very different from the one we were meant to believe." Miss Winterbourne's revelation about the disturbed evening dress had provided Poirot with the crucial thread he needed to unravel the carefully woven deception. He requested that Forbes accompany us with a candle as we returned to examine the secret passage more thoroughly. His methodical mind now focused on the physical evidence that would support his psychological deductions. The narrow corridor behind the oak room revealed its secrets reluctantly. Where the rough stone gave way to oak boarding, Poirot knelt and examined the floor with his magnifying glass. His persistence was rewarded when he discovered a small disc of peacock blue silk wedged between the floorboards, its shank snapped clean and bearing faint stains along its rim. "The missing button from Monsieur Peter's waistcoat," he announced with satisfaction. "But observe, Hastings, how it came to be here. The pressure required to tear such a button from its thread, the violence suggested by its broken shank. This speaks not of casual snagging, but of a struggle in these confined quarters." As we emerged from the passage, I noticed Diana Carrington hovering near the oak room door, her usual composure shattered by the morning's revelations. When Poirot gently questioned her about her brother's movements the previous evening, her response revealed more than she intended. "Peter couldn't have murdered anyone," she declared with fierce protectiveness. "Whatever happened to Mr. Stanhope, my brother would never—" She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the implication of her words. "Ah, but Mademoiselle Diana," Poirot observed with that deceptive gentleness that preceded his most devastating insights. "Who has spoken of murder? I have mentioned only a missing button, a struggle in the passage, evidence of deception. The conclusion that death has occurred is one you have drawn yourself." The psychological pressure was mounting visibly among our gathered suspects. Peter's face had gone pale at the discovery of his button, while Adrian Lacey maintained his political composure, though I noticed his bandaged hand trembling slightly. Lady Carrington stood rigid with the effort of maintaining dignity in the face of accumulating evidence. Poirot returned to the fireplace in the oak room, where his earlier examination of the ashes now took on new significance. Using a small implement, he carefully extracted several objects that had survived the flames, not merely fragments of paper, but small metal discs that gleamed dully in the morning light. "Brass buttons," he announced, holding them to the window for better examination. Not the mother-of-pearl variety favored by young gentlemen of fashion, but the conservative brass preferred by men of professional standing. His penetrating gaze found Mr. Edward Swain, whose evening dress bore precisely such buttons, though I now noticed that several were missing from his waistcoat. The solicitor's professional composure cracked visibly under Poirot's scrutiny. "The fire was already burning when I entered the oak room for my turn at the ceremony," he said defensively. "If buttons fell into the flames, it was purely accidental." "Perhaps," Poirot replied with that maddening mildness that indicated he found the explanation entirely inadequate. "But brass buttons do not detach themselves, Monsieur Swain. They require considerable force, the kind that accompanies violent struggle. Dr. Pritchard, whose medical training had made him particularly observant of the physical evidence, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Monsieur Poirot, if we are to consider that murder has been committed, we must address the practical question. Where is Mr. Stanhope's body? The house has been searched thoroughly. No trace of him has been found. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that particular satisfaction that indicated he was approaching the heart of the mystery. Précisément the question that reveals the true cleverness of this deception, mon ami. For what if the purpose was not to conceal a body, but to conceal the very fact that death had occurred? What if all the theatrical evidence, the boot print, the broken glass, the staged blood, was designed not to explain Monsieur Stanhope's departure, but to prove that he had departed alive? The implication struck our group with terrible clarity. The elaborate deception had not been constructed to hide a murder, but to deny that murder had taken place at all. Our Christmas mystery was approaching its final, devastating revelation, and I realized that Poirot's methodical accumulation of evidence was about to expose a crime far more calculated and cold-blooded than any of us had imagined. "The truth, mes amis," Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "lies not in what has been hidden, but in what has been displayed with such theatrical emphasis. Tomorrow we shall gather once more, and all shall be revealed." The following morning, Christmas Day, dawned with crystalline clarity, the storm having passed to leave Greystone Hall wrapped in pristine snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds under the pale winter sun. Despite the beauty of the landscape, an oppressive atmosphere had settled over the household like a shroud. The cheerful Christmas decorations now seemed to mock the gravity of our situation, their festive colors appearing garish against the backdrop of mystery and mounting suspicion. Poirot had requested that all members of the household gather in the great hall at precisely 10 o'clock, and as that hour approached, I could observe the nervous tension mounting among our assembled company. Lady Carrington maintained her aristocratic composure through sheer force of will, though the strain showed in the tight lines around her eyes and the mechanical way her fingers worried the fabric of her black mourning dress. Peter fidgeted with his cufflinks, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety, while Diana sat rigidly upright, her hands clenched in her lap. Miss Winterbourne had taken her customary position near Lady Carrington, her nervous energy barely contained as she twisted her handkerchief into knots. Reverend Vale stood with his massive frame somehow diminished by the weight of recent revelations, while Dr. Pritchard observed the gathering with clinical detachment, his medical training evident in the way he catalogued each person's visible stress. Mr. Swain maintained his professional correctness despite the missing buttons that Poirot had discovered in the fireplace ashes, though I noticed his usual confidence had developed a brittle quality. Mademoiselle Volney arranged herself with practiced theatrical grace near the Christmas tree, her emerald eyes watchful and calculating. Even Forbes and Evans had been summoned, creating an audience that encompassed everyone who had been present during the previous evening's mysterious events. The ancient hall, with its portraits of stern-faced Carringtons gazing down from their frames, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Poirot entered with his characteristic precision, his small figure radiating that indefinable authority that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. He positioned himself before the great fireplace, his green eyes surveying the assembled faces with scientific intensity, cataloguing expressions and noting the subtle signs of guilt, fear, and desperate hope that each person displayed. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his accented English carrying clearly through the ancient hall, "we gather on this Christmas morning to resolve a mystery that has transformed celebration into tragedy. But first, I must correct a fundamental assumption that has guided our investigation from the beginning." He paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing with that methodical precision that characterized his greatest revelations. "We have marveled at the impossibility of Monsieur Stanhope's disappearance, searched for supernatural explanations, and examined every conceivable means of escape. But the true deception, mes amis, lies not in how he departed, but in the elaborate performance designed to convince us that he had departed at all." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and Miss Winterbourne's sharp intake of breath. I could see comprehension beginning to dawn on several faces, accompanied by expressions of shock and growing horror. The silenced bell provided our vanished guest with unlimited time for his true purpose. The secret passage allowed him access to the muniment room, where he retrieved documents that had been concealed for 5 years. The violent message in the Christmas book was not a wish for the coming year, but a statement of intention. "Forgive me," written by a man who knew he was about to inflict irreparable damage upon this household. Poirot moved closer to the assembled group, his penetrating gaze settling on each face in turn. But Monsieur Stanhope was not alone in the oak room during his extended stay. Someone followed him, someone who understood that the evidence he sought would destroy everything they held dear. The brass buttons found in the fireplace ashes tell us of the first struggle, while the peacock blue button discovered in the secret passage reveals a second confrontation. Peter Carrington's face had gone deathly pale, his hand instinctively moving to his waistcoat where the missing button had once been secured. But Poirot's attention had shifted elsewhere, his methodical mind assembling the final pieces of his psychological puzzle. The staged evidence in the conservatory, the broken glass timed hours after the supposed disappearance, the carefully placed blood, the theatrical arrangement of personal effects, all were designed to convince us that Monsieur Stanhope had departed alive into the winter night. But the blood, mes amis, came not from a victim, but from the perpetrator. A convenient cut upon the palm, easily explained as a domestic accident. Adrian Lacey's political composure remained intact, though I noticed his bandaged hand trembling almost imperceptibly as Poirot's logic inexorably approached its devastating conclusion. The atmosphere in the great hall had become electric with tension, and I realized that our Christmas mystery was about to transform into something far more sinister than any of us had imagined. The psychology of murder, it reveals itself not in what is hidden, but in what is displayed with such theatrical emphasis, Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Tomorrow's revelation will expose not merely the solution to an impossible mystery, but the identity of someone whose cleverness nearly achieved the perfect crime. The final gathering had begun in earnest, and I knew that before this Christmas day concluded, the truth about Roland Stanhope's fate would be laid bare with all the devastating precision that characterized Hercule Poirot's greatest triumphs. Poirot's methodical gaze swept across the assembled faces one final time, his green eyes holding that particular gleam that indicated he was ready to unveil the complete truth. The great hall, with its ancient beams and festive decorations, seemed to hold its breath as he prepared to transform our Christmas mystery from impossible puzzle into devastating reality. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his accented voice carrying with perfect clarity through the hushed chamber, "we have been witnesses to a performance of extraordinary complexity, a theatrical deception designed not merely to conceal murder, but to deny that murder had occurred at all. The vanishing of Monsieur Stanhope was never supernatural, nor was it the clever escape we were meant to believe. It was the carefully orchestrated finale to a crime of calculated brutality." He moved with that characteristic precision toward the center of the hall, his small figure commanding absolute attention. "Let us trace the true events of Christmas Eve, step by methodical step. Monsieur Stanhope entered the oak room with a specific purpose, not to participate in our charming ceremony, but to retrieve documents that had been concealed for 5 years. The silenced bell provided him unlimited time, while the secret passage granted access to the muniment room where evidence of Sir Lionel's financial irregularities lay hidden. Lady Carrington's composure cracked visibly at this revelation, her aristocratic bearing crumbling as decades of carefully guarded secrets were exposed to the harsh light of truth. But Monsieur Stanhope was not alone in his knowledge of these passages. Poirot continued, his penetrating stare settling upon Adrian Lacey with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Someone else understood both the location of the documents and the devastating impact their revelation would have upon this household. Someone whose political career and carefully planned marriage depended upon maintaining the Carrington family's reputation at any cost. Adrian's parliamentary composure remained intact, though I detected a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he was calculating his remaining options with desperate precision. "Mr. Lacey," Poirot said with that deceptive gentleness that preceded his most devastating revelations, "you followed Monsieur Stanhope through the secret passage, perhaps having observed his preparations from the long gallery. In the muniment room, you confronted him as he retrieved the incriminating papers from the great oak chest. When persuasion failed and bribery proved insufficient, you resorted to violence. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Diana's sharp intake of breath and Miss Winterbourne's barely suppressed sob. The struggle was brief but decisive," Poirot continued with scientific precision. "Your cut hand, not the result of a domestic accident, but a defensive wound sustained when you grasped the letter opener that Monsieur Stanhope wielded in his final moments. The brass buttons, found in the fireplace. Ashes belonged not to you, but to Monsieur Swain, who had burned his own compromising documents in panic. But the peacock blue button discovered in the secret passage tells the true story of your violent confrontation." Peter Carrington's face had gone deathly pale, his hand instinctively moving to his waistcoat where the missing button had once been secured. "But I lost that button during my struggle with Stanhope in the passage," he protested weakly. "Indeed you did, mon ami," Poirot replied with gentle understanding. "But your confrontation was not fatal. Monsieur Stanhope escaped your grasp and continued toward the muniment room, where Mr. Lacey waited with far deadlier intentions." Dr. Pritchard stepped forward with professional gravity. "Monsieur Poirot, if murder has been committed, where is the body? We have searched every conceivable hiding place." Poirot's expression grew grimmer still as he gestured toward the muniment room. "The body, mes amis, lies where it has remained since Christmas Eve, concealed within the very chest from which Monsieur Stanhope retrieved his blackmail materials. The supreme irony of this crime is that the victim became the final secret locked away in the repository of family documents. The horror of this revelation struck our assembled company like a physical blow. Forbes, summoned by Poirot's gesture, approached the great oak chest with trembling hands and turned the ancient key. The heavy lid rose with a groan that seemed to echo through centuries of Carrington history. Within, arranged with careful precision, lay Roland Stanhope. His evening dress was disheveled, and the livid marks around his throat left no doubt about the manner of his death. The pallor of his features and the unnatural stillness of his form confirmed what Poirot's methodical investigation had already revealed. Lady Carrington swayed and would have fallen but for Peter's supporting arm, while Diana stared at her fiancé with dawning horror and absolute comprehension. "Strangulation," Dr. Pritchard observed with clinical detachment, though his voice trembled slightly. "Quick, efficient, and requiring considerable strength and determination." "Précisément," Poirot agreed. The method of a man who understood that his victim's cries for help would bring unwanted attention and who possessed both the physical capability and the cold calculation necessary for such intimate violence. Adrian Lacey's political facade finally began to crack under the weight of irrefutable evidence. His smooth smile wavered, and for the first time since our acquaintance, I saw genuine fear in his carefully controlled features. The elaborate staging that followed, Poirot continued relentlessly, represents perhaps the most cynical aspect of this crime. The broken glass in the conservatory, timed hours after the murder to suggest Monsieur Stanhope's escape. The blood, your own, from the defensive wound on your palm, carefully placed to reinforce the illusion of violent departure. The boot print in the snow, so perfectly formed and isolated, positioned where it could not be missed. The hip flask, with its convenient initials, planted like evidence in a poorly written melodrama. Reverend Vale's massive frame seemed diminished by the weight of such calculated evil. The light I observed in the conservatory during my midnight walk, it was you, wasn't it, Mr. Lacey? Creating your theatrical alibi while the household slept. Adrian's composure finally shattered completely as the full scope of his deception was laid bare. "He would have destroyed everything," he said, his voice rising to a desperate pitch. "Diana's future, the family's reputation, my career, all for money that had been stolen years ago. I couldn't allow him to." "So you killed him," Poirot said simply, his voice carrying no judgment, only the satisfaction of truth finally revealed. Not in passion, not in self-defense, but with the cold calculation of a man who valued his ambitions above human life. Sergeant Miller stepped forward with his handcuffs as Adrian's shoulders sagged in defeat. The elaborate deception that had begun with a silenced bell and an impossible disappearance had concluded with the exposure of murder most calculated and cold-blooded. As the constables led Adrian away, his once immaculate appearance now disheveled and broken, Diana collapsed into her mother's arms. Her sobs echoed through the ancient hall where so many Christmas mornings had been celebrated in innocence and joy, and I realized that Greystone Hall would never again recapture the simple pleasure of seasonal festivity. The psychology of murder, Poirot observed quietly as we watched the police motor disappear down the snow-covered drive, reveals itself not in passion, but in the cold calculation that values reputation above human life. Monsieur Stanhope was indeed a blackmailer whose crime was greed, but Mr. Lacey's crime was the far greater sin of believing that his political ambitions justified taking another man's life. The Christmas bells of the village church began their joyful pealing across the winter landscape, calling the faithful to celebration and thanksgiving. But at Greystone Hall, we stood in the shadow of revealed truth, forever changed by our encounter with a mystery that had transformed holiday merriment into something far darker than any of us could have imagined. Later, as the pale winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered grounds, Poirot and I stood once more in the oak room where our mystery had begun. He straightened the Christmas book with meticulous care and smiled down at the little silver bell that had played such a crucial role in the evening's deception. "Order is restored, Hastings," he said with quiet satisfaction. "Even at Christmas, when all should be light and joy, the little grey cells do not take holiday from the pursuit of truth." "And forgiveness?" I asked, thinking of the scarlet words that Stanhope had carved into the Christmas book with such violent pressure. "Ah," Poirot replied, his eyes softening with something approaching compassion, "that is not within my gift to grant. But truth is the beginning of all healing, even when it brings pain." He drew on his gloves with characteristic precision. "Come, mon ami. Despite everything, it is still Christmas Day, and Lady Carrington has promised us her legendary pudding. Perhaps we can find some small measure of peace in the simple pleasures that remain untainted by human wickedness." As we departed the oak room for the final time, I reflected that our Christmas mystery had indeed reached its conclusion, not with supernatural wonder, but with the all-too-human revelation that even the season of peace and goodwill cannot entirely banish the darkness that lurks within the human heart. Our midnight guest had arrived as promised, but he had departed in a manner that only Hercule Poirot's particular genius could have revealed, leaving behind a truth as cold and final as the winter snow that blanketed the ancient grounds of Greystone Hall.